Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Susan Naruki. I'm a professor in the Department of Music and faculty director of the Arts and Community Engagement Initiative in the Division of Arts and Humanities at UC San Diego. Arts and community engagement offers unique opportunities and events to members of our campus community and beyond. Above all, we place the arts at the center of essential conversation, sparking cultural dialogue and civic engagement. And I would like to thank our Chancellor, Pradeep Khoslaw, Executive Vice Chancellor Elizabeth Simmons, and especially our Dean, Cristina Della Coletta, for their visionary leadership and support of this initiative. Today's conversation is about opera, an art form that's been continuously evolving over the course of its 400-year history. I believe that opera is at a particularly interesting moment, one in which we're asking broader questions of the performing arts in general. Who's welcome on the operatic stage and in the audience? Whose stories can and should be told? So many possibilities, questions, transformations, all on the horizon. Who better to talk about that than this truly remarkable group of people assembled here today, who have in many ways paved the way for what's to come. John Adams, composer, conductor, creative thinker, whose works stand out among contemporary classical compositions for their depth of expression, brilliance of sound, and the profoundly humanist nature of their themes. His operas include Nixon in China, Dr. Atomic, and The Death of Klinghoffer. Anthony Davis, composer and pianist, best known for his operas Amistad and X, The Life and Times of Malcolm X, which played to sold-out houses at its premiere at the New York City Opera. He won the 2020 Pulitzer Prize for his recent opera, The Central Park Five, and is a distinguished professor of music at UC San Diego. Tulani Davis, professor and Nellie Y. McKay Fellow in the Afro-American Studies Department at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She has created libretti for Anthony Davis's X, The Life and Times of Malcolm X, and Amistad, in addition to libretti for operas by Bernadette Speech, Anne LeBaron, and many others. Michael Corey, lyricist and librettist, who received the Mark Blitzstein Award from the American Academy of Arts and Letters for his work in both opera and musical theater. His original libretti to operas composed by Stuart Wallace include Harvey Milk, Where's Dick, Kabbalah, Hopper's Wife, and Supermax. Daniel Bernard Romain's acclaimed work as a composer, performer, educator, and activist spans more than 2 decades. He has collaborated with a wide range of artists including Philip Glass, Bill T. Jones, Savion Glover, and Lady Gaga. He is a composer of chamber, orchestral, and operatic works and has created large-scale, innovative, site-specific musical events for public spaces. And our moderator, Mark Swed, Los Angeles Times classical music critic since 1996, whose awards include the ASCAP Deems Taylor Award, the Letter of Distinction from the American Music Center, and a Los Angeles Press Club Journalism Prize. We are so grateful to all 6 of you for being here today, and we can't wait to hear what you have to say. So without further ado, I turn it over to you, Mark.
Thank you, Susan. Between 1985 and 2017, which will be kind of the period of this talk, from Anthony Davis's X to Daniel Bernard Romain's We Shall Not Be Moved, opera in America changed pretty radically. It became relevant in a way that had never been before. There have been precedents, but something was very, very much in the air. And to begin with, maybe I'd like to ask each of the composers and librettists about a very key work that dealt with the issues of the time that really did help change the way we think about and do opera. And to begin with X and with Anthony Davis and Tulani Davis, librettist. Just to kind of set the scene, X had its premiere in Philadelphia, the American Music Theater Festival, in 1965. That was exactly 20 years after the assassination of Martin Luther X. It was 5 years after the premiere of Philip Glass's Satyagraha in 1980. And Satyagraha was really the first opera that I think made opera companies aware of the fact that, yes, you can do contemporary work by contemporary American composers, and it can have a completely new feeling about it. And the thing about Satyagraha, of course, is that it is the portrait opera of Gandhi, but it's also makes Gandhi relevant to the present, to modern times, and its last act is titled Martin Luther King. And then also the premiere of X in Philadelphia was 5 months after the Move Fire in Philadelphia, which we will talk about later because that is the subject of We Shall Not Be Moved. So it was a very key time when this happened. And can you, Anthony, talk about what you were thinking of, and also Tulani, about what you were thinking of in creating this opera, how you're reacting to the time, and also just the nature of the opera, which is, as all the operas will be that we talk about, highly eclectic, but in very specific ways. And your use of jazz and many idioms and traditional idioms as well.
Well, I guess I could start with saying that the genesis of X, when we first started, was with when my brother was in a play called El Hajj Malik. He was playing Malcolm X in a play. It was I think somewhere in New Haven at Yale, and and at the intermission after the play, my brother said to me, you know, you should do a musical about Malcolm X because of all the allusions to music that are in the autobiography. And you know, and he made this argument. He said, well, there's a parallel in terms of the musical development from, let's say, the late 1940s to the 1960s and the emergence of the jazz avant-garde in the 1960s. You know, with people like Coltrane, Ornette, etc., Cecil Taylor, and so I thought that was interesting. And but I said to him right away, I said, I don't think it's a musical, it's an opera, because it's basically a story of a tragic hero. And so that was the first step. And then we realized we needed Tulani to write it, write the words. And so I got hold of Tulani, and we talked to, and Tulani and I have been working together. We've done a lot of I've done still concerts at the Public Theater with Tulani's poetry, and also with Anazaki Shange and Jessica Hagedorn. And so my introduction to theater was actually through doing these choreo poems with music for poems. So it was kind of not that much of a stretch for me to move from that to opera. And it was interesting at that time, 1985, when we did X, and I remember vividly the mayor, Mayor Good, was coming to the performance. And so it actually changed the ending of the opera, because originally we had a gunshot at the end, but we couldn't use the gun. We couldn't have the shot because there were assassination threats on the mayor. So we had to eliminate the gunshot, which ended up being far more effective. And we stopped the opera just when they're raising the guns, and we see the guns, and he says, Assalamu alaikum, and that's the end of the opera. So I think that was it's fortuitous for the in terms of what happened to the opera, but it shows how the reality what was happening at the time, is so much intertwined with what's going on in stage, and that you never can remove yourself from that.
Yeah, I was going to say the MOVE incident, the firebombing of that block happened. I would say we had written the whole opera by then. It happened deep in our process. So it was really, it had more impact because we had to suddenly go to Philadelphia and be there for a while. And so this is how we ended up kind of getting immersed in the aftermath of it. But I think having worked with Anthony, I thought it would work because there's something really similar about the tones he hits that match emotions that I'm raising in the words. But I didn't know about writing 2.5 hours of poetry on one theme with 22 characters. That seemed like my biggest worry the whole time was if the poetry would be any good. Because I had written plays and I had a sense for how to tell the story, but I was really worried about the words being good. Because I thought I'm just going to exhaust everything I have writing 65 pages of poems, but that actually turned out to completely change how the rest of my work was going. And I do the operas actually more often than I sit and write poems. So it really had changed my work.
I saw the premiere in New York. I didn't see it in Philadelphia, but I saw it at City Opera the next year. And it was a huge event, of course. It got a ton of media. And it got a new audience, it seemed. A different, somewhat different audience, especially younger people from uptown were coming. But then the opera kind of disappeared. And I'm wondering about the kind of effect, and now it's coming back, and now it's suddenly we understand just how relevant it is. And I know, Anthony, you're revising it for a new production. But can you kind of talk about the whole function that you think of why one writes an opera about something? Is it just to do that? Is it to change society? Doesn't society, the audience members, who are we actually thinking about?
Well, you directed it to me, or I think in this case, I mean, for one thing, I think we first thought about the Black community. I mean, we wanted to write a work that would because this is such a treasured figure. Malcolm X is such a revered figure in our community. So to when we were doing that, we felt the real responsibility in telling that story, that we had to tell it right. We had to tell it in a way that would also would also resonate with the community. And so that was really the first thing. And it was so funny because I remember when I was first doing it with the producers, they were saying, "Well, you guys assume all these things. We have to have a glossary of terms, because you're talking about the fruit of Islam, you're talking about this, you're talking about different things, and that related to the creation of the Nation of Islam, and also to the story, the references, the Marcus Garvey and all this stuff, saying, well, I said, do you want to? I guess you need a glossary for Wagner operas too, but this idea of, what the reference is, that for us, the reference is our history, and also our mythology too. So then that was really important to assert. I mean, and that was something that in 1985 was when it was very different. It was very different. It was new. And from and there were a lot of challenges to the opera. I mean, from the critical world, because they said, well, opera can't be about these things. It's supposed to be about love. Opera. I remember. I guess it was Donald Hanahan or someone. No, operas have to be about love. I said, and I just laughed. And I thought, and it was very funny because on a certain level it is. I mean, the relationship of Malcolm and Elijah, I mean, and the breakup of that. The kind of paternal figure that Elijah was to Malcolm initially, and then to realize he isn't what he thinks he is. That's as old as and real as it gets. And so I think that it was very funny phenomenon doing it when we did it at City Opera. I remember I'll relay a little conversation that Rhoda Levine had with Beverly Stills, because Beverly after the show said, "Well, that was such an this is after opening night. That was such a weird night. That was a weird evening." And she then Rhoda said, "Well, how?" She said, and Beverly said, "Nobody came." And it was really interesting because actually it was sold out with people lined around the block trying to get in, and it was actually a 50% black house, which is completely unprecedented at Lincoln Center. And there were buses coming from Harlem to the show. So that was very interesting. I thought it took Ralph Ellison's invisibility a little far, but but that was part of it. But I think part of it was also the people with the money, the people who are the backers. That and City Opera paid a financial price when they did X because of some of the people who backed the opera. I think John can speak to this kind of stuff too. I mean, sure that this happens. I mean, because and I think also to the time you have to remember this is when Jesse Jackson was running for president, was 84.
Well,
So the whole background of it, well, when they said Jesse Jackson was anti-Semitic, right?
well,
And Hymietown stuff, and
even the person who raised money from individual donors at City Opera just never made a phone call for 3 months, and never told anyone she wasn't making a phone call. And Beverly raised the difference. One thing I will say about her, having made the commitment, she never wavered and never tried to get us to change what we were doing. The Black community, from the time people heard we were doing it, before I had written more than 2 scenes, I got phone calls. And the guy who ran a playwrights workshop in Harlem called me. I'd been in his workshop since I was young. And he said, "What are you doing?" I said, "I'm writing a scene about Mecca." And he said, "You're not depicting Mecca in the opera, are you?" And I said, "Well, yeah, Malcolm's going there." And he was like, the Muslims will bomb the place. You cannot depict the Kaaba. And I was like, "Oh, right. Okay. Thank you for calling." And I wrote a better opera about him pondering whether they would accept him and let him in. Um, but we found that when we were at City Opera, all the Islamic newspapers wanted to come, and they gave us rave reviews for being respectful of the religion. So there were different parts of the community that were nervous about us doing it. I remember some of the jazz people saying, "Why you want to use that antique European form, and we're breaking new ground, blah, blah, blah." So it was never, even though we were going to pains to tell the story in a certain kind of way, it was never clear to us that there would ever be any consensus around accepting the work. And I thought it was after the opening, when Hanahan wrote that politics has no place in opera, I really assumed for years the opera would never get done again till after I was dead. I just assumed that it would not happen anymore, because I think being confronted with the whole work was, it was a confrontation for people in the audience, all different kinds of people. And I was incredibly proud of it, but I did not expect to be able to go see it a second time.
Yeah, and it was interesting. I mean, the week before the opera came out in New York, Rockwell wrote that there was a headline from the New York Times, and the headline was "Malcolm X anti-Semite question mark." Okay,
Right.
so you're being set up. This is a setup now. This is you're like being pitted against the Jewish community, and you know my son is Jewish, so it's a very funny, it's not a
Right.
very funny
But
thing.
one of the important strands in the libretto for me is that the community people who are the chorus, they hear the official story, what's being put in the media, and they reinterpret it and tell you what their version is of what happened. So it's all the contention we heard is sort of built in there, that the community people have one take on it, the press is kind of hostile, they have another take. I have, having been a journalist most of my life, I put these hateful journalists in several operas, but they represent the shaping of public opinion, and then the people who are in the chorus make of it what they will and move forward. So I think in a way it was showing something that is still operative in how we deal with what goes on, all the hundreds of years old encounters that Black people have with racism.
I find it kind of amusing that the way X is now portrayed, including in the New York Times, is that it was received as a rave. That was a complete rave reception. Much is forgotten. John, I saw you smiling some. You've been there through many of these things, particularly with the death of Klinghoffer. And that's, again, an opera that dealt with the most crucial issues of our time. And I think in all of these operas, we'll be talking about what we're looking at are the people in them, the individuals, and how they are responding to the situations. These are not really narratives. This is not TV with a soundtrack. And in Klinghoffer, in particular, it was 1991. It was around, I think it was 18 years after the Achille Lauro hijacking. Still somewhat fresh. And you gave 2 points of view. And that was really difficult for people to hear. And I remember very well at the premiere in Brussels, where there was a great fear because there was a large Palestinian community in Brussels. There was a great worry of terrorism. And I think that was the first time I ever had to go through security to go into an opera. And in fact, it was the reaction of anti-Semitism in the opera that caused a huge controversy. And I think, again, like X, from people who had no idea what an opera is, or even what was even in the opera. And do you want to talk a little bit about how you dealt with something like this? And again, with an opera that wasn't heard for many years afterwards, after the initial run of productions with the various companies that had commissioned it, and a couple of companies that commissioned it wouldn't do it. And now it has come back with some trepidation.
Well, what drew me to the story was it was two things. One was that it seemed like something that you could read about in the Old Testament. You know, a murder that was based on age-old misunderstanding. Actually, if you really come right down to it, an argument over property. You know, whose land is this? Who has a right to live here? And then, of course, you know, it was also a very vivid drama that everybody had, not everybody, but many people had seen play out on CNN in the most lurid and graphic detail, the way we tend to be introduced to some horrible tragedy these days. We watch it on television. You know, even these cable networks have theme music. There might be some terrible tragedy, and within 24 hours, they've got somebody's written a theme music to go with it. So I, in my own sort of weirdly perverse way, when, you know, how I imagine operas, I was really interested in kind of making some kind of fusion of this biblical narrative and the contemporary events. Of course, it was a minefield from the start because we were treading on ground that was literally explosive. You know, I can't think of an issue that gets people as immediately at odds with each other, maybe abortion or gun rights or something, but certainly the Israeli-Palestinian issue, maybe more so then than now. And of course, the first complaints that I got came from Palestinian people, because they just, when they read that this opera was going to be made, they just assumed that it would, as usual, paint them out as terrorists. And then, of course, the opposite happened, which was, you know, we were really very careful about trying to present both of these national narratives, the Israeli narrative of this land and the Palestinian narrative of this land. And of course, they collide in the most violent ways. But the opera opened with a chorus of exiled Palestinians, and Alice Goodman's incredibly moving and beautiful poetry for both of these exiled choruses, the chorus of exiled Palestinians and chorus of exiled Jews. You know, I set them to music that, for me, was deeply moving and sincere. You know, I had to inhabit the Palestinian point of view to write that, and I had to inhabit the Jewish point of view to write that chorus. But people just found that there was, you know, there was a slant, there was a prejudice going on in the opera. And, you know, the funny thing was that when it played in Brussels, it was kind of a flop. You know, people came and they were expecting something kind of, you know, vivid and you know, the way Nixon in China was, and Peter Sellers' staging was, it was very, very abstract. And, you know, the singers played dual roles. You had one woman, Stephanie Friedman, was playing a Jewish housewife in one scene, and then she was, you know, a Palestinian hijacker in another, but there was no identification. There were no surtitles. And it was very confusing for a lot of people. And it wasn't until the opera got to Brooklyn later that year that the fireworks really started. But of course, those fireworks were nothing compared to when it was brought to the Metropolitan Opera, what, about 15 years later.
You bring up I think, a very interesting issue, which is, I think, quite common right now being talked about, and that is you were to get inside the Jewish point of view, the Palestinian point of view. And this is the essence of the opera, is understanding these people and where they're coming from. I remember I wrote right after 9/11 that this is the opera everybody needs to hear right now, because we need to understand where we're coming from, where everything is coming from. And I got the death threats too. It is that sensitive. But what about the idea of you putting yourself in somebody else's shoes? Because we're also hearing now that, I mean, can can a white person write about a black person's experience or vice versa, a straight about a gay person's experience, all of this? And opera is about getting inside other people's experiences. That's really the essence of it, and not so much telling a story. At least I think so.
Well, if we can't, as artists, make that imaginative leap without being accused of colonization or being canceled, I think there's very little hope for creative art. Think of all the people that Shakespeare imaginatively inhabited, Othello and Lear and Cleopatra. The interesting thing is that I'm neither Jewish nor nor Islamic. I'm this sort of lapsed Unitarian, and the bottom line is that I view all these things as human dramas, and I don't feel that my identity forbids me from going to the essence of what a refugee or a person who's been chased off his land or a person who feels his land's been unfairly appropriated. We can all go there imaginatively. And the bottom line is that we as composers are, we're in the position to create feeling. And that's really what these operas are about. We use feeling to probe these emotions. And the irony is that, the most flamboyant criticism that I got came from Richard Taruskin, and his point was exactly that music has so much capacity for feeling that it's dangerous.
Of course.
And that therefore, he felt, he didn't use this word back when he wrote that famous review, but I mean, he felt that the death of Klinghoffer should be canceled forever because I accessed feeling about matters that I had no business to be talking about.
I did want to offer a slightly different point of view, respectfully. Is that okay?
Sure.
I would like to say that for me, I think what is hard for me to hear is that while we're using terms and we're thinking about imagination, which I can understand, there's a reality. And the reality is, I would not feel comfortable writing music or inhabiting or trying to write music against a libretto that doesn't come from the reality of the person and the person's experience. That's for, that is for, we're kind of, to put it another way, and I respect everyone's work here. It's very clear, but death threats are one thing when, again, you actually have people dying and you actually have people in the communities that these works are operating in, namely New York City, where people are dying, right? So this is where I feel that imagination pales in comparison to someone who is actually Palestinian or someone who is actually Black, who can actually write the words from an actual lived experience, right? The death of Klinghoffer is one thing, and I saw it, and I was riveted by it, John, and I live in New York City since 1997. But if the death of Klinghoffer is one thing, what of the death of Rodney King? What of the death of George Floyd, right? As critical moments that cannot be explored in the theater because of a privilege that allows all of us to apply imagination on the one hand, but not look at the reality of what is happening in our culture and in our communities, and who is best to witness, report, create the librettos, fund, present and participate in them? Who is best to tell the story? I don't think that Malcolm X disappeared. I say that respectfully. It was erased. And it was erased because the people who are in charge didn't want it to be heard. In 1939, William Grant Still wrote Troubled Island for the same company, New York City Opera. And it was erased for 10 years. It didn't disappear. And it was erased because, and my parents are from Haiti. And I say that because my life would have changed had I been able to see that opera. My life would have, and the same way my life changed, John, when I heard Harmon O'Leary. I hope I'm saying that correctly. So I just want to posit perhaps the question in, we are talking about our operas. We're not talking about opera. And I'm moved by the conversation to be honest with everyone here and just say that I think that opera as an industry and a field is racist. It is cruel, and it is not serving our communities. Rather, in some ways, it exploits the opportunities of some to the benefit of others.
No, I don't disagree with that. It's so interesting that you mentioned who puts on these operas and why are certain operas erased. Who runs the opera companies? They are funded by corporations, wealthy Republicans. Many of the time that I've been called to a board dinner, sitting next to a person who's a total right-winger, telling me that they hate my opera. And I'm saying, then why are you doing it? And they say, well, it's good for our image, or it sells tickets. And I realize that it's very interesting, Mark, when you ask, why has opera changed so much? And why do all these political works go into a medium that is not receptive to them? And I think that the people that, first of all, the people that write these operas are drawn to these big ideas. And stories are what change people's minds and lives. And you sort of have to go into the belly of the beast to do that. And you have to bite the hand that feeds you. And to a certain perverted extent, the hand that feeds us, sometimes I think in opera likes to be bitten. I can't quite explain it, but these works, I mean, my works never could have happened without John's works and Anthony and Tulani's works. Interestingly, I came from journalism like Tulani also. And there was a reason why these works ended up in this racist reactionary art form that refused to change and only changed screaming and kicking and yelling, really. And now, today, it is more receptive to do an opera in a small venue or a black box or even a large venue than you can do in theater. Theater has kind of neglected its responsibility to create new work. Regional theater, resident theater all over the country looks to New York and commercial theater to fill its seasons out. And to a sort of sickening extent, all theater is run by the profit motive, even nonprofit theater, because the smaller theaters are looking to move their works into the profit venue to support their future efforts. Opera doesn't do that. Opera has a subscription audience, and that audience has changed. They no longer like the standard repertory, and they respond to stories that change minds, especially to passionate music. As John was saying, it's the most effective medium to change minds. And oddly enough, the form of opera, the librettists, the journalists, the playwrights, the composers that work for it have to be direct, because opera doesn't work the way theater works or television works. You don't have long sentences. You don't hide your thoughts. You don't bury your thoughts. You need to be direct, and that's what makes the music strong. So it's I think that these works evolved in a sort of love-hate atmosphere. And now it's gone to the extent that really most opera companies need a new work to anchor their seasons and sell subscriptions. Whereas in the past, it was almost anathema. It's also interesting that X I thought would be done everywhere, and Klinghoffer I thought would be done everything. My work, Harvey Milk, was done initially 3 times. Suddenly they're all coming back now. I don't know why, but my opera has 2 new productions, separate ones scheduled, Anthony and Tulani's, John's. And I think that maybe we've worn them down a little bit.
Let me just ask, how sincere do you think the opera companies are? I would say at least every other email I get these days, promotion is the right opera for the right time. Do they mean it?
They're not very sincere. First of all, there are a lot of opera companies and only a few of them are leaders. And the reason most of these works came into existence was not from opera companies. It was from BAM or a place like the Houston Grand Opera that needed to put itself on the map. And the others were all followers. But they're not very brave, and they often use what you just talked about. We are creating new works for our community as an excuse not to do controversial work. But the audience is ahead of the companies. And the audience supports these new works and wants to see them. And ultimately, the administrations change, and opera has become this forum for political works in a way that theater has not. Theater, I mean, last year we had that wonderful play about the Constitution, Why I Love the Constitution. We had Slave Play, in both intensely political works that had limited runs, whereas entertainment runs on and on forever. They both lost their investments. That doesn't have to happen in opera. Opera has figured out how to do a new work and not lose money. I think I'm being a bit all over the map here, but that's the reasons why you asked why has this change happened from the 80s and the 70s to this era in this medium. I think it has to do with the nature of the medium, the nature of how it's funded and put on, and the nature of the writers and composers that are drawn to it that don't belong in other mediums.
Well, I would go back to what Daniel said. I think George Floyd has a lot to do with that. And the fact that companies are open to it, whether how sincere that is and how long that window or door is open, that's open to question.
Well,
because that can close down in a minute. And yeah, go ahead.
Daniel said, can you do an opera like that in a forum like, in an opera house that's funded by corporate money and reactionary politics? I agree with him. I think you can't, or if you can, you have to wait. You have to wait a distance so that people can have a perspective and that the story can become part of myth. Like the Central Park 5, or like X, or like Milk. 20 years elapsed between the time of those events. Nixon and China, how many years went by before it became an opera between those events?
Well, that's what I wanted to get in there to say also. When something causes these institutions to want to be relevant, they get very clumsy because it's not really coming from a place of devotion to, let's get this one work up. Let's get this work up done well. I think we were all lucky in that respect that it wasn't fashionable and somebody took a chance on us. They had to have a total commitment to it. Whereas now I feel like, things are being put up hastily and without sort of vetting, like, how do we make this realized fully? How do we get it fully realized? Also, in terms of who's doing what, I just have to say, I used to always complain about Porgy, and it was not because of the race of the people who did it. It was because of the lack of contextual experience. So the vernacular in the opera is something no one ever spoke out loud in this country. It's a made up language, like language that was in movies at the time. So I think there's a not just an emotional investment, but it is way easier for us to use context we've lived with for a long time. But in both cases, it requires not just a lot of work, but a kind of commitment to say, okay, I'm doing something about something I don't really know a whole lot about, and whatever that takes. But I feel like there is a need for opera to hear from communities that have their own vernacular, that we're all going to go as audience and experience their vernacular for the first time and start to, like, okay, how do they see America? It's the one thing about this country that we haven't really explored, which is there are so many versions of myths, even versions of old myths, but there are so many languages in which to do them and so many contextual experiences. So yes, it's easy for me to write about the community reworking what they're hearing about how Reverend Little got killed by a streetcar, a matter that's never been settled, and say, well, this is what the Black community says about it. That's based on experience. I've heard it all my life, but that kind of investment is still what we have to do.
Speaking for writers, though, I think you can also be very political without being current. For example, Hamilton totally is on topic with this: how can opera give voice to a new historical narrative? That gave us a new historical narrative, and it very well might be the opera of tomorrow, though it's not running in opera houses now. The way that Ricky Gordon and I worked on Grapes of Wrath, we did it from the point of view, not from the Depression, but from the immigration situation of our borders that was happening when we wrote that opera. That's what I love. I call that stealth opera, where people come in and think that they're seeing something historical and safe and realize, oh no, it's about today. It's about
that's pretty much Amistad was like that too.
Stealth
I mean, because you know, it was also in the shadow of OJ. You know, OJ trial was in 1994. We were writing the opera, and that's all. It's all there. You know, it's all about the idea of the media frenzy. You know, the black body. You know, how the black body is viewed, and Talani wrote some really juicy things for journalists in that. You know, I felt it was like a beehive of journalists. You know, I tried to create, you know, like and it was fantastic because in a way using the past to illuminate where we are, who we are. You know, so that and then the conceit of the trickster god going back and forth in time all the time, and all those in terms of music.
I think that's so important. Just to interject real quickly, you know, I want to say that I'm so excited to be here because all of you have had such a profound impact on my work and the work of so many people around me. You know, when I was Bill T. Jones's music director, I'm paraphrasing him. One of the things he often reminded me, John, was he would say things like, artists are the last citizens in our culture who can do whatever they want, do whatever the hell they want. I'm paraphrasing him. And I think it's really important that we, you know, don't lose sight of that. I don't want to be misunderstood. You know, Thulani, you and I talked about your wonderful photographic essay book, which had a profound effect on me. Anthony, you know, we really need opera on demand. We really do. I've watched as much of your operas as I can, but you know, I was 14 in 1984. You know, and I was living here in this house in Margate, Florida. I'm taking care of my mother. And John, you know, it's true. I mean, so much of Harmon O'Leary, I hope I'm saying that correctly. I remember being at Vanderbilt University reading the liner notes. You're here with me now. This massive, oil freighter rising out of the ocean, and this dream that you had, to being at the Met and seeing Dr. Atomic, seeing the death of Klinghoffer, and being around those audiences. But here's the thing. Then and now, I long to be around my people too. I longed for it. And Anthony, it's so important that you're saying 50% butts in seats, right? That's what it comes out. 50% BIPOC audience seeing that, when we don't have the support of the journalist reporting what is actually happening. A little more accurate now, I'm sure, but not then. So We Shall Not Be Moved, in which we're looking at an event that happened in Philadelphia, Anthony, Delani, with the MOVE organization, a multicultural organization who often, this is a trope in American culture, they are counterculture to the time, right? Natural hairstyle, having their children born at home and schooling them, composting in the backyard, all the things that Gwyneth Paltrow does now, they were doing then. Law enforcement gets involved, and somebody has the bright idea to drop an incendiary device on a wood frame house. An entire city block is burned in the fire, and children are lost in the basement. Children are lost. And our opera picked up on 5 runaway children from Philadelphia who have decided not to learn from the teachers in their public schools, but instead go to this abandoned house and begin to learn from the ghosts of the children in that house, unbeknownst to them. And we never make it clear who those ghosts are. And, my mother's a good Catholic. So, I've always said that Lazarus, may have been the world's first Christian zombie. We think about life and death in many different ways. And I think that, as I look to what this panel, the title is so provocative, Opera and Social Justice. I think you have to look at opera and social injustice. I do. I think that opera operates within a world where BIPOC people and the LGBTQIA plus communities aren't represented and aren't allowed to participate. So how can opera give voice to a new historical narrative? I would say, when will opera give voice to a new inclusive historical narrative? And to answer your question a little more directly, Mark, I think that you have, racism isn't just malice, it's malady, it's an affliction. You have really great people at Opera Philadelphia. You've always had really good people in opera who are rooting for and supporting and investing in the BIPOC community and other communities. This panel, by the way, has a certain balance to it, which is really interesting to me. Presumably, there are 3 white people. Presumably, there are 3 people of color. Not enough women, in my opinion, but you get it. Yeah. But I think that the reason why opera has changed so radically is because you had people like John and Anthony and Thulani and Michael who were willing to do radical things and push the culture forward. I'm wanting to embrace that, pick up that mantle, do radical things, and push the culture forward. Unfortunately, you still have the people who are truly in control, the people who truly make the decisions, really are resisting. It's the board, it's the executive directors. So therein lies the conflict. Sarah Williams at Opera Philadelphia all but made that opera happen. And if Sarah Williams was a general manager at the Met right now, I don't think you'd have all those musicians laid off. I don't think you'd have all those crews desperate for work. So again, there's a cruelty in opera that is there, has always been there. And I hope that part of the artistic change could be what I would call a shared morality. Is it possible for opera to have a shared and broad morality that isn't exclusive to race or time, but really is exclusive to this time and this exploration of morality?
I think it's artists to be activist about it, like yourself, like John, like Tulani, like the fact that you got a whole new audience, and not to mention a whole new chorus for X. They had to not use their salaried chorus and bring in a whole new bunch of people. I had it in my contract that the second balcony had to go to people from AIDS hostels for my opera. I brought that from journalism, and I brought what you're right. We can do whatever we want to do, and they fight us every step of the way, but it's about taking steps. It's about taking steps and ultimately breaking out of these walls of opera and doing it everywhere, out of opera house.
Okay, I'll tell a story. When we were doing Amistad, we had two choruses, one black, one white. Okay. The black chorus had auditioned 5 times to get that job. I came to a rehearsal and all the maestros were there, and I was, this was about 6 months in advance. I was to talk diction or answer questions about diction. That took like 5 minutes. But the choir mistress said to me, could you do a healing for us? And I was like, a healing? And she said, yes, could the chorus, meaning the chorus that worked there all the time, we need a healing for singing these words. And I said, you mean like a laying on of hands? And she said, yes. And I think I was a Buddhist minister by then, but I'm not sure. But I was like, I'm not really equipped to do a laying on of hands. I'm not authorized to, I don't think it would help you. And she said, we need a healing for having to say these horrible words. The words they were saying on occasion came out of newspapers in New York in 1839. They were direct quotes. And they said, everybody's going to think we're racist. We have to call somebody a blubber lip coon. And I said, there's somebody you're calling that is on the other side of the room. Could we ask the chorus members who auditioned 5 times to be called that? Could we ask you what that's like? And they said, we're happy to do it because it's true. If it's true, we're happy to do it. And I said, so when you walk out of the theater at 3 in the afternoon or 5 and go home, no one on the street thinks you're a racist. They're not even thinking about it. When these singers leave at 5 o'clock, they still might have to worry if they're going to be followed when they go in the grocery store or the drugstore or whatever. They live with being misunderstood and misapprehended all the time. No one is actually going to misapprehend you when you leave this theater. It is helpful to us in telling the story that you're playing this part. And she remained unconsoled. But to me, that is part of what making new opera causes, that you have to sometimes even just get the people to look at the people across the room or get them to talk to each other. Eventually she came to see me during rehearsal and she said, I don't understand why you're here a month before opening night. Joyce Carol Oates only came to dress rehearsal. And I said, I'm fixing things or catching things or responding to things you tell me. And she said, we usually get the opera in a kit and then we just put it on. And I said, you're making the kit. And she was just floored. So to me, it is a total commitment process. It's one thing to try to get in the door, but then also to do it, you have to be in dialogue constantly. I only ever got interviewed about those words. People would ask for an hour of my time and they only said, why is the language so harsh? I said, well, it happened. So to me, it's the process of also being in the room with the creatives who are going to make it happen that creates change.
Is it time to move past the institutions? And it seems there is a big move in that direction, that so many younger composers now are writing operas. Operas are being done everywhere, and they're being done on very small scales for just few people. And in a kind of post-COVID world, that seems that there is more and more of a move away from the big institutions. And are the big institutions just too big to really be dealt with?
I think it's great if we have all kinds: opera without walls, opera done in empty swimming pools, opera on big stages with 60-piece orchestras. They all have their own kind of power and vocabulary. So I don't see why we should move away. I think we should just keep expanding.
Yeah. I found it more difficult. Actually, it's funny because I wrote several operas. I had a period where I wasn't being commissioned, so I decided to write smaller kind of chamber operas. I wrote Lilith and Lear on the Second Floor. And what was interesting to me, because my intention was I was going to write opera for theater, so it could be done by, in a black box theater, anywhere, And what was funny is that it was harder to promote these pieces and get these pieces done other places than it was for me to do the big pieces.
Oh, that's an opera.
Yeah, that's an opera. I mean, or it didn't fly. It was very, very interesting. I mean, maybe because it was too big. It wasn't like As One, where you had like two people in an opera or something like that. But I think that that it sort of fell in the cracks of that, and it was more difficult to get going, and it was something I sincerely wanted to do, because I felt that there wasn't at one point I wasn't sure there was a future for me in the opera house. I mean, because of what had happened in the intervening years. So that was my and I loved doing those works because I felt a kind of freedom and abandon, and they're both comic too. I mean, to bring the comic element into opera, I felt would be really interesting. And a lot of my chamber operas have tendency to have a more of a comic aspect to it, and I thought that, and I thought that the libretto was really witty and funny, and so I thought it might play with it, but no, I mean, maybe in the future. Well, I think now college groups are getting more interested in some of those operas, but I think I feel, but really the larger operas had much more chance for success, and it's if they want the things to, like, if they're going to hire a BIPAC person, they want it to make a splash. You're supposed to make a splash, and so and I think that's part of it. That's part of it, and I felt and that's been an interesting process for me, and one earlier thing to talk about is when I wrote Wakanda's Dream, which was dealing with Yusef Komunyakaa, and I did a piece called Wakanda's Dream. It was about Native American family, and the trial of Standing Bear. And that was interesting for us because when I first started the office, I said, how am I supposed to do this? I mean, what Daniel's question loomed large, as a composer, and tried to understand, then I realized also my grandmother was Native American, so maybe, okay, I can kind of maybe I can get away with this. And then what? But I had a residency with the Lakota and with the Ponca, and I spent a lot of time there going to powwows and and then I realized how invested they were in the opera, and it really gave me an incredible strength about it, and to the point that when we opened in Omaha, we had someone bless the stage, a Native American, someone from the Lakota. So that was really fantastic, and it opened my vision of opera to a lot of a different kind of vision of, particularly sonic vision of opera.
Daniel, you mentioned the writing about opera in the press, and I wanted to ask Mark. Mark, when Nixon and China are these operas came out, there was you, there was Joshua Cosman, there was John Rockwell. There were 5 critics who understood what was going on. And the rest of them were saying, oh, these are CNN operas. Oh, they're exploiting current events. They're selling audience. They're making events, not operas, not music. It took a real long time for that to change. Has it changed? And has the writing about opera caught up with what the artists are doing?
To some degree, it has, because almost nobody's left.
That's right.
Writing about it. But the people who do, the younger people who come along, they have a very different point of view. And I'm not entirely sure how much they understand anything. And now it's just kind of everything's acceptable if it's politically correct. And it's not if it isn't. But yes, there is a much more open mindedness, of course, to things and expectation of that. But my question to all of you is also, how much does making a big splash harm your work? I mean, the very fact that you're making a big splash and the way it's exploited in that way, and it was particularly true with works like X and Nixon in China and those early ones, and maybe to some extent with Harvey Milk, is that it's all about it. In the end, becomes all about the splash and not about the work. And that's one reason why I think the works don't continue on, because everybody's just moving on to the next splash.
I think that's not exactly the way it works. The way that these operas came to life was that there were programs like Opera for the 80s and Beyond that funded them. And in order to get your opera done, you had to have 3 or 4 commissioning companies to do it. So your opera had a built-in movement going from one city to another right at the beginning. And almost in no cases at all were those operas ever, because whether they had made a splash or whether they were critical successes, they did not get second productions because it was not conceived of in the original equation. And most of the opera companies couldn't get funding to pick up those operas because they had already been funded. And the splash was more helpful to the opera companies than it was to the artists. Opera companies realized they could make a splash, and it almost didn't matter if it was a good opera or a bad opera. They could make a splash and sell their seasons, and they couldn't make a splash by doing X, which was already 10 years old. They would only get national press to come if it was new. So I think the press kind of was a good deal of the problem. And now you just say there's no press left.
Daniel, you are the next generation of composers. Your opera, I think, had a tremendous reception. It's a deeply moving and very eloquent piece that would seem to me has a real life ahead of it. Where do you see you're going and how you're thinking about this kind of work now in the environment that you're in?
Oh, that's a really good question. I should probably, I wish I had your optimism in a lot of ways. I mean, first of all, I am privileged, right? I am. I'm alive, I'm healthy, I'm breathing. I'm with all of you today. My mother so I just want to keep saying in case I get interrupted, my mother just came into the kitchen. She's elderly now, and I have the privilege of being able to take care of her. This is Margate, Florida, where I grew up. There's a piano right over there that I bought for $200 with my dad that I first started learning piano on. And all of us have these stories. They're particularly hitting home now. I have an 11-year-old biracial son who's half Catholic, half Jewish, half Black, half white, understands his Haitian ancestry. And I'm well aware of your sons and your daughters and your families. And, I think about legacy now in a way I didn't 25 years ago. I'm 50 years old now. And I'm thinking about not only the future of my work, but the future of the work. And even this moment, that's, I will be using in my classes at Arizona State University. I will be using at Dartmouth College, where I'm a visiting professor. And I will certainly be thinking about even the answer to your question, in which I've written a few operas, but We Shall Not Be Moved is the one that was produced. It hasn't gotten any subsequent performances. And as far as I know, no one's asked. And by the way, I unfortunately don't see that as being unusual. And I say that only because I'm, in many ways, I'm not nearly as experienced in opera as Anthony Davis is, or Michael, or Tulani, or certainly Mr. Adams. And I'm certainly hoping it gets subsequent performances. But more than that, I think I'm really thinking about this time where everything is so precious, where literally singing is still dangerous, right? Singing is dangerous. You can't be too close. So I hope that when we come back, and as we slowly start to come back, I got my first vaccination shot. I'm wanting to be part of new ideas and offer up new ideas. I think that opera, I believe, is work, right? Translated, is that right? Does anybody know what this
work?
Work? Yeah, work. So, yeah, I think that's such a great word. I have a feeling everyone here, their fathers probably worked really hard. Their mothers, my mother, God, worked really hard. I think that the work before us, sure, I would love to see my opera receive subsequent performances, but more than that, I hope the moral amnesia doesn't set in. I think there really is an opportunity now for us to think about what are the endless possibilities for us to really talk with one another and have an equal exchange of ideas. I think sometimes a conversation is on the precipice, particularly for me as a Black person. Sometimes I go into a conversation, or even a possible conversation, and I'm not always sure what to say or what the answer is. So let me try to offer something. Here's what I would say to you, Mark. Here's an idea. I would love to see an opera house in this country do something what I'm calling 100 by 25. X, Anthony, 100x 25. Over the next 25 years, this is the challenge for any opera house out there. You would commission 100 operas by BIPOC people, 4 a year. One would be online, one would be outside, one would be chamber, one would be large, right? And 100 by 25 would be a way to literally change the field, to literally talk about subsequent performances. It would be kind of baked in, built in. I think the creation of work uplifts past work. That's what's happening. We Shall Not Be Moved's limited success, and it had limited success. It was performed in Australia, by the way, the Dutch National Opera. And there were talks of it being performed elsewhere, but it didn't work out. All of that said, I think that work is having its own success, and had its own success that was directly related to the success of Anthony Davis and Michael, and certainly Mr. Adams. So I think that, I think an idea, and there are so many ideas that are talked about and being talked about in opera. More directly, I just wrote a 5-minute opera for Prototype, Beth Morrison's wonderful project. That was called, I think, yeah. Prototype Festival, and that was a 5-minute kind of cinematic movie opera. That was the commission size and scope. It is available, online right now. So I think that if you think about the work, I want to be part of change that can help others who are younger than me, and perhaps older than me too, find real success in our opera house, and really see the opera house as a place of ownership and a place of embrace, as opposed to a place that can be, quite frankly, frightening and alienating oftentimes.
I think that's a wonderful idea. Artists are sometimes asked to be on foundation panels to help them decide how to give out money. I came up with an idea that was called the 666 program. $6 million, 6 new works, 6 new operas, 6 years, and each company would go, each new opera would go to 6 different houses. And the only caveat was that the other 5 companies would have to respect the decision of the 6th and do that opera, whatever it was. The problem with saying that opera companies should do this is that they dislike each other. They don't like each other's work. They don't feel that they can do the works because they have different sizes stages or different, they have a million excuses. I think the way to get around that is to get artists running the opera companies, to get artists more involved and boards of directors less involved, if there's a way to do that.
And this actually goes right back to the beginning and to X and to Beverly Sills, doesn't it? Who was actually very supportive of an awful lot of new work that she wasn't particularly her, but when she got behind it, she was really supportive of it.
No, it was amazing how that worked. I mean, I remember when we did X, it was very funny. And this is a story about the foundations. Originally, when Beverly approached us about doing the work, she thought she had support from the Lila Atchison Wallace Foundation, and they agreed to donate $250,000 toward any new work that Beverly would choose. So she chose X, and then they withdrew the money. so you could see, right away, how the corporate influence works in that regard, and it was very funny. Someday I'll write a book all about this a lot of these episodes, because I think it's illuminating in terms of our culture, also celebrity culture, how celebrity culture works as well. But
very beautiful. I had an opera canceled actually because of the death of Klinghoffer. I was doing the Garden of the Finzi Continues, and the company was so worried about the reaction of the Jewish community to the death of Klinghoffer that they canceled my commission. And it's finally coming back in January of next year at a new company, but they're so worried of offending groups.
And let me ask one more question. And how do you see the relationship of opera in America to that in Europe, and particularly places like Germany, the Komische Oper, and other places where there is so much more openness to new kinds of ways of thinking about things politically? Or is that real, or is that really true?
Well, John can speak to that, but I haven't had any productions in Europe, except for I had Tanya was done in Austria, Vienna Opera, Opera de Wien did it. But I have to say that it's interesting because I think their understanding of American work is very narrow, and they don't really understand. I think that maybe at this point it might change because they're having a racial awakening, too. I mean, what happened here? There were demonstrations in Germany. There were demonstrations in France, and France has been overtly resistant to. They don't want to be like America. They don't. They're worried about their racial politics being infected by the American example. So. Yeah, but so I think it's a very complex thing. I mean, I think it would be natural to do, X or Amistad in Britain, for example. But I remember in 1987, I was doing a tour of England, performing one of the Arts Council tours with my group, and I was did an interview with the BBC, like Liverpool BBC or something, and the guy said, "Well, you have operas with such odd titles. What's with this opera, Malcolm the 10th?" And so after I was rolling on the floor in laughter, so it was just, so I think they weren't ready for X at that point, but maybe now they are.
Can I just say one thing about authenticity, since Daniel was saying how important that was? This has to do with your opera, Tanya. Anthony?
Yes, sure.
Yeah. Well, I was at that bank robbery.
Well, I should put you in
I'm
the
not
next time.
kidding. That bank robbery, the SLA, took place on Noriega Street in San Francisco.
I know, yeah.
In April of 1974, and it was one block down from the old San Francisco Conservatory campus where I was teaching, and I went to cash a check that morning. It was in the days when if you needed cash, you actually went inside the bank and you wrote out a check. I think I wrote out a check for $5 to make it through the week. And when I got there, you know, there were all these police cars and an ambulance and everything. And you know, all we knew at the time was that it was a bank robbery and you know, there'd been gunfire and somebody had been injured.
Wow, I'm
the one that should have
funny.
written that opera.
That's
Anyway,
deep. That is really deep. Wow.
So I just had a couple of comments. I can address Mark's question about Europe a little bit. I mean, it does seem to me that we've been talking about almost two different things here. One is opera as an art form, its meaning, how it addresses human experience, you know, both on a social level and on the deepest intimate levels. And then we're talking about the business of opera and, you know, boards and opera companies and how we can't get our pieces repeated and things like that. And I assume that's the cruelty and the exploitation that you're referring to when you say that opera is racist and cruel and it exploits us. You know, first of all, in my dotage, I've actually discovered Verdi. I never liked Verdi, but that's been a big thing I've discovered this year. And part of the reason is just I've been absolutely taken with the complete emotional honesty of his music. But what I've noticed, and I also read Alex Ross's amazing book about Wagner, is that these guys were phenomenally popular. And it wasn't just their operas or they themselves who were popular, it was that the art form was popular. And so they were, to make a really, really trite comparison, they were like the Martin Scorsese's, you know, or the Steve McQueen's of their time, people saying really important things, but with enormous audiences, you know, like Bruce Springsteen, okay? Again, these are really very lame analogies, but I just need to point out that as a composer of operas, I have to be extremely humble and extremely realistic because my audience is just minuscule. And to think that I could influence people, you know, by the political statement that's embodied within a work, whether it's The Death of Klinghoffer or Dr. Atomic or any of my other works, I think is an act of enormous arrogance, because in general, I know from sitting in the audience in one of my performances that you know, we're basically preaching to the choir. You know, most of the people that are coming to see our works are people who politically are inclined to, you know, to agree with what's being said. So, I mean, I always bear that in mind, which is why I think when I'm attracted to a story, like for example, the atomic bomb, that attracted me a lot because I grew up during the Cold War and I was truly truly freaked out as a kid by the possibility of an atomic bomb being dropped on East Concord, New Hampshire, where I lived, right there, you know. And I was attracted to that story because it had enormous psychological weight. But I never feel when I'm writing these operas that I'm actually going to change, make people go and vote. You know, if I really want to change the world, I need to go to Nevada and stand in front of a polling place, or Florida or Ohio, or I need to write a big fat check for, you know, is that Kamala Harris behind you? I can't tell. It looks like it.
It is. It is. Thank you for mentioning that. It is. Yeah.
She was born in our hospital here in Oakland. But you get my point.
I do.
I think that, you know, it's very easy for artists, and particularly, you know, composers who feel marginalized or feel whatever the words are, written out or ignored, that first of all, we're working in an art form that is not particularly popular. You know, I mean, really, opera is like at the Metropolitan Opera. What do they have? 5 Puccini operas in one season? You know, it really is mainly for people to go and hear familiar tunes sung by great singers. It can be a wonderfully creative art form that engages our experience, and that's what I hope that I've been able to do with my work. But I think we just need to, you know, always be extremely humble about, you know, just exactly how influential what we're doing really is.
You know, Anthony and I are working on a piece with Sarah Schulman, the great activist writer, who was one of the founding members of ACT UP. And back in the day, Sarah said to me, Michael, why don't you come to more ACT UP demonstrations? And I said, you know, I'm writing, my art is my activism. And she said, oh, that's bullshit. Very similar to what you were saying. Very few people see your art. If you want to be activist, come out onto the streets and lay down. But don't confuse what you write with activism. And I agree with that. On the other hand, I've had some very rewarding experiences, like before an audience of Republicans in Minnesota at the premiere of The Grapes of Wrath, when a man came up to me crying. He said, I'm a total Republican. And but now I feel I understand the situation with Mexican immigrants. They're just like the Jode family. They just want to feed their family and get honest work. And I said, oh my God, that's the Lord's work. You can chip away at it. I think we can do more than nothing.
I hear you, John. I am so, I know that being able to have a full life and a total career as a composer started with what I saw as a young boy in this house. I'm reminded of Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie's The Danger of a Single Story. And I think what I'm most aware of is that my role and responsibility as both a composer and an educator and someone who is sitting on boards, namely the League of American Orchestras and the Association of Performing Arts Professionals, that, you know, if we're not careful as a community about what our communities are seeing repeatedly, that's the danger of the single story. And, you know, as artists, we choose what we want to say and do and where we want to say and do it. And I always respect that. I think as artists, we can advocate. And, you know, I can say it this way, just so that I'm clear. I just think it's fundamentally wrong that the Metropolitan Opera has never commissioned a Black man or woman. And what I mean by that is, let me put it another way. I know that my son will be better to go into that particular opera house and see the first commissioned work by a Black woman or a Black man. The same way I was so moved by Dr. Atomic and the moment of the bomb, John, and how it was slowed down. I'm sorry, it was so long ago, but there are moments in the theater that you never forget. You talked about Satyagraha, Mark. Well, you know what? I remember the last act, and yes, and there he is, the back of Martin Luther in slow motion, the silhouette. And, I think that kindly and humbly and respectfully, politicians tell you where to drive. And, I always say when politicians fail us, artists have always led the way. Mm. And somebody said earlier, art can sometimes help you feel. That's what I long for. I just long for equity. I just long for, and the reason I mentioned the Metropolitan Opera House is because certain institutions have broad national and even international influence, right? So I am not in disagreement with anyone here. I'll leave it with this, Mark. I'm excited by the type of advocacy that the six of us might be comfortable with. Because I know that we're all good people, and I know that we're all and I know that we all care. I know that we all care about our communities. And I think that the absence of multiple stories, and that's the name of this panel, right? The panel is talking about the future. I just think we have to be very much aware of, and that's what's happening in the streets. Black Lives Matter. I mean, this is about this notion of we need to be more, I think we do. We need to be more inclusive in the stories that are being told, and more importantly, the stories that are not being told, and why.
I completely agree with that, and I wasn't saying that I don't think we matter. I was just saying. I was just saying I'm constantly aware of in the larger picture, what a small group we are.
You're right.
I was recently reading about Leontine Price's story, and
wow.
I mean, if you read about her or you read about Duke Ellington, how those people were amongst our greatest talents. For me, I'm much higher. Duke Ellington is, for me, much higher on my love scale than any other American composer. And to see or to read about the struggles that they had, I think what's going on right now is really important. And I agree with you completely that, an opera house, not just the Metropolitan Opera, but any other organization that hasn't commissioned a Black composer at this point. I mean, come on. But I think that what art does is I wrote this down. Your phrase, you said shared morality, and I think that's a very profound intuition on your part, and I join that together with this idea that art, and particularly music, and above and beyond all, music is the art of feeling. It's making people feel. And that's what happened to you when you had that experience with the last moment in Satyagraha, and that's what happened to all of us when we're deeply moved by something.
It also, when I was doing Central Park 5, it was really interesting because it creates a different kind of part of the moment in the community. For example, I did a lot of panels and discussions with the Innocence Project, and with a lot of people who were falsely incarcerated. I met a man who was in a prison in Louisiana for 30 years for a crime he didn't commit, and they all came to the opera, and it was really interesting because, in a way, giving them voice, giving these people voice. That was very powerful for me because I felt that something we can do as composers is to give voice to these voice these stories and voice these people, and then also, so I had people in the audience come to me at intermission. I was in jail for 7 years. I'm one of the Sacramento 7. I'm one of this. I mean, it was unbelievable. It was just like to realize that, the also the wide scale stakes of what happened to the Central Park Five wasn't unique, but I think that in probing that, and also I guess John always mentioned the emotional aspect of that, the emotions of that, and then also creating a kind of empathy that we can create. The idea of identifying that. When I did the opera, I wanted everyone to feel they were the five. I didn't matter who they were, but they would feel that.
Can I just say one thing about, I twice visited Venezuela back before it really tragic things happened there. Actually, when Gustavo Dudamel was still living there. And I saw the El Sistema firsthand, these orchestras that are made up of kids from really desperately poor neighborhoods. And it so profoundly affected me because these kids were exposed to classical music at a really early age, and they didn't know that it was uncool, and they loved it, and they played it. And what has so troubled me about what's going on in the United States is that pop culture is it's just so enormous. It's this 1,000-pound gorilla in the room. And that what we just so badly need to do is expose kids, young kids, to really good stuff, not just classical music, but to great art and great literature from an early age, so that they grow up with an appreciation and a love for it, and also with a real sense of critical ability to tell what's schlock from what's really valuable. And my wife and I have created a small foundation, and for years we were giving money to new music groups and sort of standard contemporary music activities. And especially in the wake of the George Floyd events and the Black Lives Matter, we realized that the strongest thing we could do is to move our support to, well, right here in Oakland, and to give support to the Oakland public schools, which have enormous amounts of talented kids, but they don't have instruments. And the funding for music teaching is constantly being cut, and that is what I really think is where a lot of activism can happen.
Getting back to the idea of how can opera give voice to a new historical narrative, it's true, John, that our operas get done 3 performances here, 4 performances there, 6 performances 10 years later. And the net audience is not huge, it's very small, but things do get into the ether. X was the first dramatic dramatization of that story. The Spike Lee movie followed, and it became myth. My Harvey Milk opera was followed by the fictionalization. My Grey Gardens was followed by a movie version. I'm sure that the Central Park opera that you just wrote is going to be commercialized and made into a movie. These ideas do get down, and they come from us, from artists. And so, though we may not have the mass audience, we are putting our ideas out there. And this, for some reason, is the medium that we are able to put them in. We can't put them into commercial theater. We can't put them into movies, and we can't put them into pop schlock. We can put them here.
I was just going to say, I think I have a different view from all of you about this. I grew up in a community that expected me to start registering voters when I was 11. I was marching in my hometown routinely. It was incredibly empowering for me. I was also expected to give back with the skills that the entire community was investing me with. And I was asked to integrate the junior high school across town. But I was allowed to make the decision. My father didn't make the decision. It's like, you don't have to do this if you don't want. And so for me, that's just every day, because the idea was long-term struggle. It will take more than your lifetime. You must do this all the time. You have to stay engaged. So, I've never missed an election that I could vote in. I just never have. And here in Wisconsin on 2 occasions, that was a challenge. I didn't have to go stand in the rain, but I had to go out in the street and look for a stranger to witness even my absentee ballot, because they're trying to repress more the vote of my students than mine. But that's a continued thing. That's just part of your life. That is just like you need to walk a lot and get exercise, and long-term struggles like also everyday things. So in one way, it helped me with the other problem about the art, which is to not have the big expectations. I have no idea what effect the work's going to have, but it's long-term struggle. So you put it out there. It is just incumbent upon me, I think, to create the work and see that it gets done if possible. Beyond that, I'm going to have a really good night that night. But beyond that, I don't know. And I feel like it engages my ego, my hubris, and all this, the rat race impulses to say, my work must have this reception. It must have this audience. It must be on for 5 nights, not 4. I do want to struggle that is seen more than once, but its real impact on people. I'm not actually expecting to know that. And you get delighted a lot of times because somebody will stop you and say, I hug every person who was at the original X. There's 12,000 of them. If I meet one, I say, please let me hug you. You were there. But it is not, I feel like I just need to keep my eye on what am I doing now? And it is not disengaged from long-term struggle. So that's how I think maybe I look at it differently.
Can we hug on Zoom? I was there. I loved it. It changed my life.
I will be looking forward to hugging you in New York sometime soon too.
And Nixon in China just absolutely changed my whole perspective on everything, on what could be done.
And I saw Klinghoffer in San Francisco, and I'm suspicious that I may have gotten to meet Mr. Adams in a very crowded, very posh bar that I spent the evening in. But that Peter Sellers.
If I was there, somebody else was picking up the tab.
Yes, well, I think that was true for me. I had brought Eduardo Galeano.
Oh, wow.
Peter Sellers was hosting us. So, but it was a thrilling experience for me. And it was still as a church in there, I didn't feel like anything was happening except intense attention, intense listening. Just like we want to make sure it may have been coming from a bad place, but there was this intention to hear every word. I want to be able to know that I've gotten this. Yeah. So it's different from what being in other operas.
You know, it is funny because when I'm listening to all of you talk about your experiences, I realize that one of the things that, that just occurred to me during the lockdown, during this pandemic, is how envious I am of young composers who are making these small, they're almost like pop-up operas, and I had just signed on to do this big opera. I got a commission from a company that's having its 100th anniversary, and I agreed to do it, first of all, because I love the orchestra, and for me, my most wonderful experiences have not been in the opera house. You laugh when you hear this, but my most wonderful experiences have been when I've either conducted myself or been in the hall, when it's just been almost like an oratorio, when you can hear the orchestra. I did Dr. Atomic at the Barbican in London, and with a BBC Symphony Orchestra, and there was some minor staging going on, but it was just this wonderful experience because you could hear the orchestra, and you didn't have just all the baloney that goes on in a opera house where the bad sight lines and the acoustics are terrible, and then I did a Nixon in China about 4 years ago at Disney Hall, where and there was just a little tiny bit of staging, and I frankly wish if I were younger, I would go back and just try to do small things. I did one small thing. I did a show called I Was Looking at the Ceiling and Then I Saw the Sky with, and June Jordan wrote the libretto. And, it was funny because it just never caught on. And I'm still very fond of the I wrote 24 pop songs, but I think just the fact that a composer in everybody's mind was associated with symphony orchestras and classical music, and they just absolutely would not accept or take my songs seriously. And I wish that I could sort of rewind my career and go back and be able to do smaller things the way Stravinsky, when times got tough and he couldn't do Firebird right spring, he did L'Histoire du Soldat, and even Benjamin Britten did those small things. So I'm very admiring of these smaller scale projects that you guys are doing.
Well, we are in a time of crisis and in some ways war. And John, there's a wonderful orchestra called the Magic Orchestra out in San Francisco. Mina Choi founded it and runs it.
Sure, yeah.
If you want to do something small, I know you can do something small with it. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So I would love that. I mean, I'd love to know what 5 minutes means to you. Right? What would you do if you had 5 minutes and only 5 minutes, or maybe 10?
Well, I'm not talking that kind of small.
Oh, okay. Cool. I will say real
small budget.
Yeah. Go ahead, Mark. Sorry.
Speaking of small, we're going to have to wrap this up very soon. And there are a couple of questions, and maybe we can have one of them just very quickly, which is one of the participants is asking where musical aesthetics fit into the conversation. What is the relationship between radically political, inclusive institutions and practitioners and topics of opera and the sounds and words that they contain?
Okay. Well, I think sometimes I guess I'll start it. Anyway, but sometimes I think about it a lot as how you represent conflict, how you represent, and to me, it's always there's in each of the operas, in some ways, there's a battle of music goes on that has to do sometimes with different kinds of material, and I was sometimes it's about tonality, how I use tonality. I mean, whether I want to break it apart or whether I want to fall into it. You know, the kind of what happens with that gravity, the gravity of tonal music as opposed to less tonal music. And then I think it's something I play with because a lot of times I look at political thing, particularly when I think of Amistad, you know, because of representing, like, you know, think about the Missouri Compromise or the California Compromise, or thinking about our whole governmental system that was built on a big lie, so that everything that's American, and I can play on that. Sometimes I play with Aaron Copland that way. I have Aaron Copland, but I'll have something equally tonal in a different key against it, because I want to feel that the sense of, you know, okay, there's a home there, but there's something, there's an internal tension that has to play out through the music, because that tension existed from the beginning in our country, and it should exist in the music. And so that feeling of the ambivalence of our history, and that ambivalence being represented musically in terms of conflicting musical ideas. And that's something and it's always been an antiphonal thing in my music that I think that carries that through, and that sense that, you know, maybe these are unresolvable in some ways. It doesn't ever really resolve. So that, but it transitions from one and mediates these polarities.
I've been able to work with the great Mark Bamuthi Joseph, and, you know, the opera that I wrote, well, the opera that I wrote with Mark and Bill had a spoken word artist in it. That was very important. I'm writing an opera right now for Lyric Opera of Chicago with Ann Devere Smith.
Oh,
And
yeah,
we're trying to figure out, we're trying to figure out how I label them non-operatic voices, and how that can operate with and against, and actually in consort with operatic voices. But I'm also really interested in Tulani, your view on this. I'm really kind of curious about how you approach the libretto and language.
I have to say, in working with Anthony, I already like the palette he paints with, so I'm kind of like, we'll also have a discussion about this woman has put down her baby. She's just fed her baby. She's in her village. She put her baby on the ground and was kidnapped. And she's frozen in that moment. I got to get back to the baby. And so I might be thinking it's some kind of lullaby, and then he might write absolutely counter to that. And I'm going to trust that. So I'm not there to dictate my musical aesthetic. My musical aesthetic is whatever he's going to do, I'm probably going to like it. The only time I'm going to, I think, because I'm setting rhythms a lot of times, I may have a very specific one in my head, but I think that's one of the ways in which we work well together. It's like, because I'm constantly aware that I also need to be moving the rhythms in different ways, so that we don't all get bored to death. But it's, in this case, we were able to do some shifts, like with X, from bebop to these very, or from a very little lyrical child singing a solo to bebop, and then out again to a moment of prayer in Mecca. And that's what I like about doing opera. It's like, it's one continuous sort of thought, but it can make those motions from huge to very quiet. And I would say that things we're talking about are more the emotional things in the scenes than every once in a while he'll tell me something, some piece of music we both heard that he heard that's in there somewhere. I have a couple of notes from this week it was Malachi Favors. These two notes are Malachi Favors, and so it's a journey through a lot of music that we heard in this lifetime that we might have heard live at the same time or during the same time. So I think I've written for electronic music, which I really enjoyed, and I have written for instruments I'm not accustomed to, which I also enjoyed. So for me, it's like being pushed out of my comfort zone is important.
I hate to have to stop this, but we are out of time. And I want to thank the panel. This is a discussion that I haven't heard in this way before. And I think actually it will become a historical document. So thank you very, very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great seeing you all.
Yeah, it's great seeing you, Mike.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure.
Hey, Daniel, great to see you. Hope we can talk some more in the future.
I would love that.
And when is X coming back?
It'll be at Michigan Opera Theater is going to do it, and it opens in May, and then we're going to go to do it in Boston and do a recording after that.
Amazing.
Excellent new recording of it. Yeah.
And I'd like to thank you all once again for this remarkable conversation. Mark, Daniel, Michael, Talani, John, and Anthony. It's just been amazing to have you with us today. So thank you so much. The time has flown. And to our audience, thank you for being with us. We hope to see you at other arts and community engagement events. Thanks again, and good afternoon.
Thank you. Thanks, Susan.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.